Hi, my name is Fatima Madani, and the topic I chose for this video presentation is breast cancer. So to start, breast cancer is the formation of cancer cells in the breast tissue. Cancer cells are abnormal cells that divide uncontrollably and destroy body tissue, such as breast tissue in this case. There has been evidence of breast cancer that can be dated back to ancient Greek times. In fact, Hippocrates included it in his theory and even included descriptions of the stages of breast cancer. Between 476 and 1500 AD, there wasn't a lot of medical progress because it was intertwined with religious philosophies. So very few surgeries were performed and not much advancement was made in that time period. But by the 19th century, William S. Halsted, the professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, performed the first ever mastectomy in 1894 with the emphasis on removing tissues in one piece to prevent spread and removal of the pectoralis to prevent reoccurrence. So the breast cancer and its treatment cause fatigue, pain, lymphedema, lower bone density, changes in weight, changes in mood, hair loss, or even the side effects of early menopause. The implications of this is each year in the United States, about 255,000 cases of breast cancer are diagnosed in women and about 2,300 in men. About 42,000 women and 500 men in the United States die each year from breast cancer. In 2018 alone, cancer patients in the United States paid $5.6 billion out of pocket for cancer treatments. Breast cancer patients have additional costs even after of breast cancer, such as annual mammograms and other exams they have to do. So here I have included an estimated age standardized incident rate map in 2018 for all ages, and then I've also included a mortality rate map also in 2018 for all ages. So what's interesting to see here, and what I would like to point out, is how in the incident rates, they're really high in North America here, but here in the mortality rates, they're kind of on the lower end in the United States and in North America. But here in Africa, where the incidence rates weren't as high, the mortality rate seems to be extremely high compared to the United States and North America, which they do mention in the study later. So the study I chose was Exposure to Traffic Emissions Throughout Life and Risk of Breast Cancer, the Western New York Exposures and Breast Cancer Study. The authors were Jing Nai, Jan Bia, Matthew R. Bonner, et al. Journal. The journal that included this study was the Cancer Causes and Control, Volume 18, pages 947 through 955, published in 2007. So the objective of this study was to examine breast cancer risk in relation to exposure to air pollution from traffic emissions throughout life. Some of the risk factors they found were traffic emissions exposure, which would be the habitat vertex, education, which would be the behavior vertex, family history of breast cancer, and age, which both belong to the population vertex. So the methodology design used was a case control study, and the data collection that they have was in total that they had 1,068 cases and 1,944 controls. In-person interviews were used to collect data on potential breast cancer risk factors. The risk factors they found were race, age, education, body mass index, smoking history, usual diet during the period 12 to 24 months prior to interview, medical history, reproductive history, family history of breast cancer, previous benign breast disease, and occupational history. Self-reported lifetime residential histories were also collected. A geographical traffic exposure model was used to estimate traffic emissions at these histories. So GIS was used by, first they used the addresses provided were geocoded using ArcView 3.2 with GDT Dynamap 2000 as the reference theme. ZP4 software was used to correct and update the zip code for each address before the geocode process. And then a geographic traffic exposure model was used to estimate historical residential exposure to traffic emissions in those areas that the participants provided. So the traffic exposure model entails the choice of a scale factor corresponding to higher emissions at intersections where vehicles are constantly accelerating and decelerating. The reason for this is carbon monoxide air concentration is highly correlated with polluted air concentration in cities. So here I have included the tables. This table includes the exposure to traffic emissions throughout life and risk of breast cancer, and the results of this table will be discussed here. So in the table, it displayed for premenopausal women, there was some indication of an increase in breast cancer risk for traffic emissions exposure at the time. For trend, for the association was 0.03, and the fourth quartile odds ratio was 2.05, meaning the premenopausal women that were exposed to traffic emissions were 2.05 more likely to develop breast cancer than those that were not. And for postmenopausal women, they found that traffic emissions exposure at the time when a woman gave birth was associated with the higher risk of breast cancer. But there was no evidence that exposure to traffic emissions for any other of the time periods was associated with the breast cancer risk. So, in conclusion, they found an increased risk of breast cancer among premenopausal women exposed to more traffic emissions and among postmenopausal women exposed at first birth. The observed increased risk was limited to non-smokers. This means that people that smoked cigarettes were already being exposed by combustion from smoking, so the traffic emissions did not really make a difference for them. Although some of the P's obtained for the trend were statistically significant, these increased risks appeared to be non-monatomic, and so further studies needed to really examine the cause and effect here. So the limitations of the geographical model is it does not consider the fact that exposure estimate in each residence is not merely determined by traffic emissions, and then changes in road networks were not considered. So this was a study collected over time, and the roads did change over time, so that was something that was left out. And they did not consider any time the participants spent away from home. And as a case control study design in general, it's subject to bias.